The rain came down hard on Providence that Thursday night in March, the kind of cold that sinks into a person's bones and refuses to leave, and Margot Wexler was walking home through it because the last bus had stopped running an hour earlier, and even if it hadn't, she couldn't have spared the fare. 27 years old, thin enough that her collarbones showed above her scrubs, her copper hair tied back with a rubber band she'd pulled off a pill bottle. She'd just finished a night shift mopping office floors downtown after a full day in a clinic lab, and everything she carried fit in one bag: a box of leftover food for her little sister, 3 unopened medical bills, and a few crumpled dollars. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was counting her steps, the way she counted everything, because counting was the one thing that had ever kept her standing. Then the toe of her boot caught on something soft in the alley behind the old laundromat, and when she crouched down, she found a young man bleeding out on the wet concrete, 3 bullet wounds in his chest, his eyes barely open. Most people would have called for help and kept walking. Margot didn't, because she'd already held her beloved mother while the life drained out of her many years before, and she'd sworn she would never stand frozen like that again. She knelt in the icy runoff and pressed both hands to the wounds, and the dying stranger's fingers closed around her wrist, and he whispered a single word that turned her blood to ice, a name everyone in this city knew and nobody dared say out loud. She should have run right then. Instead, she took him home, and by the next morning, the most powerful and most dangerous man in Providence was standing at her door in a black wool coat and leather gloves, and he hadn't come to say thank you. He'd come to learn exactly what she'd seen, and what her silence was going to cost her. Who was the boy in the alley? Why would a crime lord burn his own empire to the ground to protect a woman he'd never met? And what secret lay buried in a stack of unpaid medical bills? A secret with the power to bring an entire city down. If this story's already got its hooks in you, do me a small favor. Tap that like button, share it with someone who loves a story with real heart, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's head back to that rain-soaked alley in Providence and find out what Margot Wexler set in motion the night she chose mercy over fear. Margot's fingers found the pulse in the young man's neck by instinct, a reflex carved into her after years of medical training and lab work, and she counted in silence, as though those numbers were the only thread still binding him to the living world. The beat was weak, slow, wavering, but it was still there. Her other hand had already reached into her pocket for her phone, her thumb sliding across the screen that flared white in the rain, and she was about to call the 3 familiar digits anyone in this situation would have pressed. But at that very moment, his ice-cold fingers tightened around her wrist, with a strength that seemed impossible for someone losing life one drop at a time, and he shook his head, his pale lips moving faintly. "Don't," he rasped, his voice breaking like cracked glass. "Call them, and you'll kill me." Margot froze. She had seen enough terrified patients to know when someone was delirious and when someone was telling the truth through pain, and his eyes, though clouded by blood loss, still held a chilling clarity. "You've been shot," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm, the way she always spoke to people who were about to collapse on an examination table. "You need a hospital. Right now." He swallowed with difficulty, and every word seemed to drain away another fragment of the strength he had left. "The people who come won't be wearing white coats. They'll come to make sure I never get up again. And you're kneeling beside me, so they'll remember your face." He coughed, a wet, muffled sound, then struggled to open his eyes wider so he could see her more clearly. "Is there anyone waiting for you at home? Someone you want to go back to?" For reasons she couldn't explain, the question drove straight into the softest place inside her chest. Because yes, there was someone, a little sister sleeping in an apartment only a few blocks away, and the thought that some nameless men might follow her all the way there sent a cold through her spine deeper than the rain. She looked around the alley. Providence at night stretched behind her like a city forgotten by the world, its red brick rooftops darkened by rain, the sickly yellow glow of street lamps spilling across puddles and broken stains, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded from the harbor, low and hollow and lonely, like the sigh of a place long exhausted by the secrets it had been forced to keep. There wasn't another soul in sight. Not a single window still shone with light. There was only her, a stranger slowly dying, and a decision she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Her hand returned to the wound and pressed down hard, warm blood seeping between her fingers and mingling with the rainwater. "If I don't take you anywhere," she said slowly, speaking more to herself than to him, "you'll die here in about 15 minutes. Do you understand that?" One corner of his mouth lifted, almost a smile. the kind of smile worn by someone who had stood at the edge for so long that he no longer feared it. "Then give me 15 minutes, he said. "Somewhere they won't find me." And Margot, a woman who had spent her entire life following procedures, following protocols, following instructions printed neatly on paper, did the exact opposite of everything she had ever been taught. She slipped one arm beneath his back, feeling the weight of a man's body beginning to surrender, and dragged him upright, bracing her slender frame to hold him. He was far heavier than she had expected, and every step became a battle. Her shoes slipped on the wet pavement, her breath came in broken gasps, and her heart hammered wildly, not from the strain, but from the fear closing around her throat. She guided him through narrow alleys, keeping away from the lights, keeping away from the main roads where any passing car might belong to the people hunting him. His blood soaked through the shoulder of her coat, warm at first, then gradually turning cold beneath the rain. And still she kept moving, her head lowered, her lips pressed tight, her legs trembling but never stopping once. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he had been shot, who wanted him dead, or what kind of weight was carried by the name he had just whispered. She knew only one thing, the same thing that had made her kneel beside him instead of walking away, that she couldn't, not one more time in her life, stand and watch someone fade when she still had 2 hands left to try. By the time they finally staggered to the back door of the aging building where she lived, her hands had gone numb, and she had to lean him against the wall while she searched her pocket for the key. A pitch-black staircase led to the small apartment on the 3rd floor, and there, beyond that fragile door, a child slept peacefully, unaware that her sister had just carried an entire storm across the threshold. Margot lowered him onto the peeling linoleum floor of the kitchen, the only place in the cramped apartment with enough room for her to work without waking her little sister, then rushed to gather everything she could find. She had no emergency room, no sterile operating table, no team waiting behind her. She had only the hands of a laboratory technician and a poor woman's kitchen, but that would have to be enough, because it had no choice but to be enough. She switched on a small flashlight and wedged it into the spice rack hanging on the wall, turning its head until the white beam shone directly onto his chest, and in that cold light, the wounds emerged with horrifying clarity. She took out a needle and thread kit she had bought from a pawn shop down the street, something meant for purposes she had never cared to ask about. Quickly sterilized the needle over the flame of the gas stove, then used the bottle of saline she always kept in the cupboard for the times her sister needed it to wash away the blood and mud clinging around the openings of the wounds. He groaned softly when the solution touched his flesh, his body tightening by instinct, and she placed one hand on his shoulder to hold him still, her voice dropping into the soothing whisper she always used with patients who were trembling with fear. "Stay still now. I'm here. I won't leave you alone," she said. And she couldn't tell whether those words were meant for him or for the panic screaming inside her own mind. She leaned closer, probing each puncture with fingers covered by thin rubber gloves, and realized that 2 of the bullets were lodged shallowly, caught just beneath the muscle, without striking anything that couldn't be saved. With tweezers she had heated over the flame, she removed them one by one, slowly and patiently. Each time metal scraped against metal, he clenched his teeth, and each time, she whispered that it was almost over, that he only had to endure a little longer. The first bullet dropped into a chipped ceramic bowl with a dry, sharp clink. The second followed, and she released a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. But the 3rd bullet was different. It lay deeper, angled to one side, dangerously close to where she could see his skin pulsing above a major blood vessel. And she knew, with every fragment of professional judgment she still possessed, that if she touched it here, on this kitchen floor, beneath this makeshift flashlight, she would kill him faster than the men who had shot him. Her hand hovered above the wound, trembling. Then she pulled it back. There were limits even compassion wasn't allowed to cross, and she had learned that truth in the most painful way possible. She turned instead to stopping the bleeding, pressing gauze firmly over the remaining wound, winding bandages around the broad expanse of his chest, and tying them off with fingers drenched in sweat and a stranger's blood. And in that very moment, as the heavy scent of warm blood rose through the cramped room, something inside her suddenly faltered. A door she had believed locked forever opened a fraction, and for a single heartbeat, she was no longer in this kitchen, but somewhere else, on another night, beside someone else she hadn't been able to save. She drew in a deep breath, closed her eyes, and slammed that door shut with every ounce of will she had left, because she wasn't allowed to fall apart. Not now. not while someone was still breathing beneath her hands. She returned to her work, her hands steady once more, and finished the final stitch, cutting the thread with the small scissors she usually used to open her sister's medicine packets. When everything was done, she sank onto the floor with her back against a kitchen cabinet, her chest rising and falling heavily, and stared at the stranger whose wounds were now crudely bandaged, his skin still pale but his breathing a little more even than before. She didn't know whom she had just saved. She didn't know whether what she had done was an act of kindness or a mistake that would come crashing down upon her entire life. Then, as though he could feel her gaze, he stirred faintly, his lashes trembling as his eyes opened, and those clouded eyes found her in the darkness. His lips moved, and from deep within his throat came a few broken sounds. A name, Rourke. Then another word she had never heard before, Bellwether, before his eyelids fell shut again, and he slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving her sitting there with those two unfamiliar words suspended in the air like a prophecy she couldn't yet decipher. A faint sound came from the bedroom, the soft shuffle of bare feet across the wooden floor, and Margot's head snapped up, her heart pounding, just in time to turn and see Junie standing in the kitchen doorway, her sleepy eyes blinking beneath the beam of the flashlight, her hair tousled from the pillow. The 8-year-old girl was much smaller than other children her age, her skin pale from the dialysis treatments that had taken too many things from her that a child should have been allowed to keep, yet her eyes carried a strange maturity, as though she had learned far too early that the world wasn't gentle with people like the two of them. Margot hurried toward her, her first instinct to shield her view of the man lying on the floor. But Junie didn't panic, and she didn't scream the way almost any other child surely would have. She merely tilted her head and studied the scene before her with the quiet curiosity of someone accustomed to seeing bandages, needles, and bodies in need of care, as though none of it were especially unfamiliar in her young life. "Is he hurting, Margot?" she asked, her voice soft and filled with concern, and Margot knelt until she was level with her, placed both hands on those small shoulders, and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, he's hurt, but I'm taking care of him now. You don't need to worry." Junie peered over her sister's shoulder, studying the bandages wrapped around the stranger's chest with solemn attention, then looked up and asked a question that made Margot's heart tighten, a question so innocent it was almost cruel, because it revealed everything the child had already absorbed about the life they shared. "Does he have to pay, Margot?" she asked in a tiny voice, "or are we going to owe more money again?" Margot went still for a moment, and in that instant, she saw the whole childhood her little sister had lost. A childhood that should have been filled with questions about clouds, stars, and why cats said meow, not questions about money and debt. She knew why Junie had asked. The child had sat beside her too many times while she opened envelopes with trembling fingers, had watched her sister's face darken too many times at the sight of the numbers, had come to understand, in a way no child ever should, that whenever someone needed help, there was always a price attached, a price the two of them could rarely afford. Junie had grown up among collection calls, regular dialysis sessions that pulled her from sleep, and the hushed conversations of adults, wondering whether a sister still far too young could truly manage to keep her, and all of it had taught her to read the atmosphere of a room faster than she had learned to read words. Margot pulled her close and held that frail little body tightly, and through the thin fabric of the child's nightgown she could feel the small tube still attached to her abdomen, the thing that connected her to the machine keeping her alive, the thing Margot would have traded everything to see removed one day. "No, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle but firm, trying to pour into every word all the steadiness she could borrow. "This time is different. He doesn't have to pay anything, and we aren't going to owe anyone more money, I promise." It was a promise she wasn't certain she could keep, especially with the stack of unopened bills still sitting in her bag like a time bomb, but she spoke it with complete sincerity because it was the only thing she could give Junie in that moment, and because she would rather carry the weight of one more promise than allow those clear eyes to worry for even one more second. Junie nodded, trusting her sister as she always had, with the absolute faith only a child could give, to the person who had become her entire world, then let out a long yawn as her eyelids began to droop. Margot knew it was time to return her to bed before the cold of the kitchen seeped into a body already so weak. She lifted her into her arms, and Junie was so light that it made something ache deep inside her. That fragile weight, both the most precious thing and the greatest fear of her life, then carried her back to the bedroom and lowered her beneath the blankets that still held the warmth of her body. Junie still refused to close her eyes completely, her lashes lifting and falling as though she were trying to hold on to her sister for just a little longer. So Margot sat on the edge of the bed and began doing what she did every night to guide her into sleep. She softly recited the numbers, 1, 2, 3, steady and gentle as a lullaby, and her little sister's breathing gradually slowed to the rhythm of her voice, her eyes growing heavier, until each breath became deep and entirely peaceful. Margot remained there for a long while, watching the child's face in the darkness, watching the rare serenity only sleep could bring her, then quietly rose and returned to the kitchen, where the strange man still lay breathing evenly beneath the flashlight's glow. She sat with her back against the wall between the two worlds of her life, her beloved little sister sleeping beyond one door, and a blood-soaked mystery breathing beyond the other. And in the silence of that deep night, a chilling sensation began to rise within her, the feeling that when she had pulled this man across the threshold of her home, she had unknowingly thrown open a gateway into a strange and dangerous world, a world that now knew exactly where she lived, and knew there was a child inside that small apartment. The digital clock on the microwave cast a sickly blue glow, and Margot watched the numbers crawl slowly through the depths of the night, 4:12, then 4:20, each passing minute. Another minute she spent keeping watch between two fragile breaths inside her apartment, one belonging to the little sister sleeping beyond the door, the other to the strange man lying on the kitchen floor. She was so exhausted that her mind hummed with numbness, her eyelids heavy as lead, but she didn't dare close them, because some part of her, the part that had heard his broken warning clearly in the alley, knew with absolute certainty that this night wasn't over yet. At 4:31, her telephone vibrated on the kitchen table, an unfamiliar number with no name displayed, and she hesitated for a long time before answering, pressing it to her ear without saying a word. There was no human voice on the other end. There was only rain, steady and heavy, pattering through the line, and what turned the back of her neck cold, what made every fine hair along her arms rise, was that the rhythm of that rain matched perfectly, beat for beat, the rain striking the window directly behind her, as though whoever was on the other end stood beneath the same sky, taking the same storm, separated from her by only a few thin layers of brick. Then the connection went dead, leaving behind a silence more frightening than any sound. Quote, she lowered the telephone, her hand so cold it had lost all feeling, and sat perfectly still. Every nerve drawn tight as she listened to the apartment, to the entire building, to the whole city sleeping beyond those walls. At 4:40, she heard it. Footsteps. They weren't hurried, and they weren't furtive. They came with a horrifying steadiness, one after another on the old wooden staircase leading to the third floor, slow and unhurried, as though the person climbing didn't care whether anyone heard him, as though he wanted her to hear, wanted fear to have enough time to seep into every strand of flesh before he reached her door. And Margot, unable to stop herself, began counting again. But this time the numbers were no longer the professional tether that had steadied her in the alley, nor the gentle lullaby beside her sister's bed. They had become a funeral bell striking directly against her eardrums. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, each number tightening the terror inside her another degree, closing around her throat, until she counted the final stair, and the footsteps abruptly stopped, directly outside her door. A silence stretched between them, so long that she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, so long that she almost wished he would simply knock and be done with it, because anything would have been better than that suffocating wait. Then it came. 3 knocks, slow and evenly spaced, so polite that the courtesy itself made them more terrifying than any violent pounding could have been. It wasn't the knock of a panicked thief or an impatient brute. It was the knock of someone who knew with certainty that the door would eventually open, sooner or later, whether she wanted it to or not, the knock of a man who had never needed to hurry, because nothing had ever remained beyond his reach. Margot rose, her legs no longer seeming to belong to her, and crept toward the door, holding her breath as she pressed one eye to the tiny peephole. Through the warped lens, she saw a man standing in the dim hallway, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark black sweater soaked through with rain that somehow still looked chillingly immaculate, his hands in black leather gloves resting at his sides. He stood perfectly straight, patient, and calm, like a man waiting for his turn to enter a solemn ceremony. He didn't glance around, didn't fidget, and made no unnecessary movement. He simply stood there in silence, and then, as though he knew exactly that her eye was pressed to the peephole on the other side of the door, he slowly raised one hand, holding the glowing screen of a smartphone. Margot narrowed her eyes to see more clearly, and when she recognized the live camera feed displayed on it, the blood in her veins seemed to freeze into ice. It was Junie, her precious little sister, lying tucked beneath the blankets in the bedroom just a room away, her face peaceful in deep sleep, completely unaware of the lens watching her. To see that ordinary, private, harmless moment captured through a lens in the hand of a stranger standing outside her home at nearly 5 o'clock in the morning told her, more clearly and coldly than any spoken threat ever could, that he was watching them right now. He knew who her sister was, he knew where she was, he knew even the places that had seemed safest in their lives. He knew everything. Then a voice came through the wooden door, deep, slow, and dangerously smooth, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it in order to be heard. "Miss Wexler," the voice said with measured calm, "my younger brother is inside your home. I don't intend to break down the door. I've never cared for damaging anything that belongs to the person who just saved the life of my own flesh and blood. But I'll stand here and wait patiently until you decide to open it for me." And Margot, her heart beating like a war drum inside her chest, her breath lodged tight in her throat, slowly raised her trembling hand toward the lock. The lock released with a dry click that echoed through the silent night, and the door slowly opened, revealing the man in the black sweater as he stepped across the threshold of her home, carrying with him the smell of rain, damp wool, and another faint scent she couldn't name, the cold metallic scent of a world she had never touched and had never wished to know. He didn't ask permission, and didn't wait to be invited. He simply entered in, calm, measured steps, and Margot moved backward to let him pass, feeling as though her tiny apartment had suddenly contracted around his towering frame, as though his presence had drawn every breath of air from the room. His eyes swept across the cramped space, quick and sharp as a surgeon's blade, taking in everything within a single instant. The blood-stained kitchen table, the needle and thread, the absent child behind the closed door, and then his gaze came to rest on his younger brother, who lay breathing heavily on the floor, and something in his entire bearing changed. The man who had entered with the cold authority of someone who held life and death in his hands suddenly stopped, then crossed the room in several long strides and lowered himself beside the young man. He didn't inspect the wound, didn't check his pulse, and didn't ask a question. He merely raised one gloved hand and placed it with extraordinary gentleness against his brother's pale forehead, a gesture so unexpectedly tender from a man who radiated danger. And in that fragile moment Margot caught a glimpse of something profoundly human, something soft, hidden behind that shell of ice, but it lasted only for the length of a single breath. Other footsteps sounded from the staircase, quicker this time, and a heavily built man appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, his head bowed as he waited for orders with the submissive posture of a subordinate. He murmured something, reporting that the family's men had traced the person who fired the shots, that he was hiding somewhere across the city. The man in black slowly rose, and when he spoke, he didn't shout, strike the table, or growl his words. His voice dropped even lower than before, so quiet that Margot had to hold her breath to hear every syllable, and it was that very softness that made each word colder than a blade pressed against the throat. "I don't care about the man who pulled the trigger," he said. "Anyone can hire a man to pull a trigger. What I want to know is who showed them how to find my brother. No outsider could have sold the blood of this family. A tree rots only from within, and the traitor is always standing inside his own house." The burly man's face went pale. He bowed even lower, stammered several words of agreement, then hurried away, and Margot, pressed into the corner of the kitchen, felt for the first time in that endless night an entirely different kind of fear, not the fear of a brutal man with blood on his hands, but the fear of a cold mind silently calculating, a kind of power that never needed to shout in order to make people tremble to the bone. Then the man turned toward her, and as though he had removed one mask only to put on another, all the menace in him softened, giving way to a courtesy so polished it was almost impossible to believe. "You treated my brother," he said, his gaze passing over the bandages wrapped around the young man's chest, the chipped porcelain bowl containing 2 bullets, and the needle and thread still lying on the table. "You removed 2 of them, but there's still one left inside him. Why didn't you remove the last one?" The question was asked gently, almost with curiosity, but Margot understood that it was a test, a trap designed to measure what kind of person she was. She lifted her head and fought to keep her voice from trembling. "Because the 3rd bullet is too close to a major blood vessel," she answered. "If I tried to remove it here with these makeshift tools, he would bleed to death before I could do anything to stop it. I know exactly what I can reach and what I can't." The man studied her for a long time, his gaze measuring and searching all the way to the bottom of her, as though he were reading her from the inside out like a page in a file, and it was only then that she noticed that throughout their entire conversation, even when he had touched his brother's forehead, he hadn't once removed those black leather gloves, not even inside the warmth of the apartment, as though some deeply hidden reason kept him from ever exposing his bare hands to another person's eyes. Very few people truly understand the limits of their own abilities, he finally said, his voice thoughtful, as though he were speaking of something far beyond the matter before them. And because they refuse to understand them, most of them have paid with their lives. Then he walked toward the kitchen table, reached inside his coat, and withdrew a thick envelope, placing it on the worn wooden surface, amid the streaks of blood that hadn't yet dried, a slow and decisive gesture, as though in his world everything in life, even gratitude, even a human life, could be neatly converted into whatever lay silently inside that envelope. Margot looked at the envelope lying there, thick and silent among the dried streaks of blood, and she knew perfectly well that all she had to do was reach out and pick it up, for some of the burdens weighing down her narrow shoulders to become a little lighter, the unopened bills in her bag, her sister's coming dialysis treatments, the debt that grew larger with every passing day, like a black shadow waiting to swallow them both. To take it would be to take hold of a little room to breathe, a little safety she hadn't tasted in a very long time. But she reached out, and instead of picking it up, she pushed it back across the stained tabletop toward the man. "I didn't save him for this," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion but without the slightest trace of uncertainty. The man in black looked at the returned envelope, then slowly raised his eyes to her, and for the first time since entering the apartment, something changed in them. A sharper attention, a genuine curiosity, as though she had just done something very few people in his life had ever dared to do in his presence. "Almost everyone would take it," he said quietly. "And you should take it too. If you accept this money, then everything that happened tonight ends here, neatly and cleanly. You never saw me, never saw my brother, never heard my name. You returned to your life, and from this moment forward, we never have to meet again." He paused, then continued, his voice slower and deeper. "But you refuse it. And that's the problem, Miss Wexler, because once you refuse, the debt remains suspended between us, unpaid. And in the world I belong to, unfinished debts never disappear on their own." A chill ran down Margot's spine, because she heard in his words not merely a warning, but something that sounded almost like a promise, an unwanted bond tightening around her before she could stop it. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the apartment once again, and this time it settled on the small framed photograph resting on the old shelf, a picture of the two sisters taken during some rare, peaceful afternoon, their faces pressed close together, and then he turned back to her. "The child," he said, "the girl in that photograph. What is she to you?" And Margot, her instinct to protect her sister rising more powerfully than the fear closing around her, lied without a second of hesitation. "My niece," she answered, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I look after her for someone in the family." The man studied her, and a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not a warm smile, but the smile of someone who had caught a lie completely and had calmly decided to let it pass. "You're lying," he said gently, without the slightest note of accusation. "But you're lying to protect her, so I won't pursue it. I respect that. People only lie in that way when they truly have someone in their heart whom they love and need to protect." He allowed the words to hang in the air for a moment, then continued, and this time his voice lowered into something almost confessional, a rare glimpse into the world to which he belonged. "When my father was alive, he taught me something, and it's the only rule in this family that has never been permitted to be broken under any circumstances. Whoever saves the blood of the Rourke family has a claim upon that blood from that moment onward. It means that beginning tonight, whether you want it or not, whether you believe it or not, I owe you, and I'm a man who always pays every debt in full." Margot stood in silence, not knowing how to answer a declaration that sounded both like a gift and like a sentence binding her to him, and all she could do was remain still, feeling the invisible weight of those words slowly settle upon her shoulders. She looked at the man before her, the man who could drain the color from a burly subordinate's face with a single quiet sentence, the man who placed money on a table as though he believed it could purchase everything in the world, yet who respected one small lie and willingly bound himself to an ancient code of honor. And in that moment she realized that he was far more complicated and unpredictable than the terror his name inspired throughout the city. And precisely in that quiet moment, a faint groan came from the floor, making both of them turn at once. The younger brother was stirring, his eyes opening slightly, and this time his gaze was much clearer, but also more desperate, more urgent. He tried to lift his head from the floor, his dry, cracked lips trembling, and broken words escaped his parched throat, weak yet so urgent that the entire room seemed to hold its breath and listen. "Brother," he rasped, his clouded eyes struggling to find the man in black. They used real people. Those records, they aren't just papers. They're people. An enormous ledger, built from human beings who are still alive. The man in black dropped to his knees beside his younger brother at once, leaning close so he could catch every faint word. And the young man struggled to continue, each sentence draining away what little strength remained in him. "Bellwether," he groaned. "They're laundering money through it, through dialysis patients, false bills, treatments that never happened, people's names attached to them so dirty money can pass through and come out looking clean. I found out. I was going to bring the evidence to you, but they found me first." Then he slipped into unconsciousness again, utterly spent, leaving the two people still awake in the kitchen with the truth he had revealed hanging between them. The man rose slowly, and for the first time that night, Margot saw something fracture across his cold expression. Not anger, but a silent horror, the horror of a man who had just discovered what the foundation beneath his feet had been built upon all these years. "For years," he said, his voice so low that he seemed almost to be whispering to himself, "I believed I was only moving numbers across paper. Accounts, loans, shell companies. I thought it was nothing but paper and ink." He paused, curling his gloved hand into a fist. "It turns out I was moving it through people, through the sick, through real names." Margot stood motionless as a chilling thought began to take shape inside her mind, a connection she didn't yet dare name, because Bellwether wasn't unfamiliar to her. It was the very place where her sister went for dialysis 3 times every week, the name printed across every bill that arrived in her mailbox with the regularity of a curse. Her hands suddenly trembling, she crossed to the bag she had abandoned in the corner of the kitchen at the beginning of the night and pulled out 3 unopened envelopes she had carried throughout her shift. Bills she had kept postponing because she hadn't found the courage to face them. She tore them open, spread the pages across the table beneath the flashlight, and began examining every line with the eyes of someone who worked in medicine, someone who understood these charts better than almost anyone. Then she saw it. The treatments listed there, the dates, the service codes, the charges. But some of those sessions had never happened. Junie had never gone to them. Margot clearly remembered those days, remembered her sister being at home, lying on the sofa, drawing pictures, nowhere near any clinic. Yet there they were in black and white, phantom treatments bearing her sister's name, turning her precious little girl into a line of data inside that enormous money-laundering machine, into a number through which dirty money could flow. "Here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My sister. They did this to my sister. These treatments never happened." The man in black stepped closer and took the bill from her hand, his eyes moving over the printed lines. And when he turned the page over to look at the back, his entire body went rigid, because there, across the blank reverse side of that cold demand for payment, were the uneven pencil marks of a child learning to write. One name traced again and again with painstaking care and determined effort, each trembling letter darkened, as though the child who had written it were learning to declare to the world that she existed, that she had a name, that she was a human being, and not a string of numbers. The man stared at those childish letters, and something inside him seemed to collapse. The contrast between the soulless machine that reduced human lives to data and the tiny hand struggling to write its own name into the world left even a man like him silent. But when Margot looked up, she noticed something else, something that unsettled her. His younger brother, though still drifting in and out of consciousness, had opened his eyes and was staring at the bill in his brother's hand, and his face, already pale from blood loss, had turned strangely colorless, with an expression born not from physical pain, but from something deeper and darker. His lips moved as though he meant to speak, but then he stopped, turned his face away, squeezed his eyes shut, and sank into a heavy, bewildering silence, the silence of someone who had just understood something he wasn't yet ready to put into words. Morning came to Providence beneath a pale and deceitful light, the kind of sunlight that made people believe the storm had passed when in truth it had only just begun. And Margot, after dozing for a few hours in the kitchen chair, was awakened by the first ringing of her phone. It was the Office of Child Protective Services, a polite and emotionless voice informing her that they had received a report expressing concern about Junie's living conditions, that a case had been opened, and that someone would be coming to inspect the home and determine whether a woman who worked 2 jobs and lived in a cramped apartment was fit to continue caring for a seriously ill child. Margot hadn't even finished the call, and her hand was still trembling, when the second one came, this time from an attorney representing the insurance company, his voice smooth as oil as he explained that because irregularities had been discovered in her sister's enrollment records, all of Junie's insurance benefits had been suspended immediately pending an investigation, which meant that her next dialysis session, the treatment her small body couldn't survive without, wouldn't be covered. And while Margot was still sitting there in stunned silence, the machinery of paperwork delivered its final blow, a call from the very clinic where she worked, curtly informing her that her employment had been terminated over allegations that she had violated sample handling procedures, a vague accusation she knew was false, yet one written so perfectly that she had no way to challenge it. In the space of a single morning, not one bullet had been fired and not one drop of blood had been spilled, yet her entire life had been torn apart piece by piece. Her job, her sister's insurance, and even her right to remain the person responsible for Junie, all of it stripped away by cold strokes of ink across pages she had never even seen. She collapsed onto the floor with her back against the refrigerator, and in that moment of being pulled under, her mind slipped back to the place she always tried to avoid, the night many years ago that had shaped the woman she had become. She saw the dim room again. She saw her mother lying there, the woman who had given birth to both her and Junie. She saw her own hands, still young and clumsy then, trying to do everything she knew, everything she had learned, to keep that breath from leaving. She had pressed down on her mother's chest, called her name, begged her, screamed into the darkness, but life had continued to slip silently through her fingers like water, until all she could do was hold the body that was slowly growing cold, and understand that she was powerless. It was in the darkest night of her life, as her mother drew her final breath, that something formed inside the young woman she had been, not surrender, but a vow carved into the marrow of her bones, that she would never, never stand frozen and watch a life fade while her hands were still capable of doing something. And it was also from that night onward that she had stepped forward, a girl far too young to carry such a burden, and fought for the right to raise the little sister who had just lost her mother, to become everything Junie had left in the world. That was why she had rushed into the alley to save a stranger. That was why she could never simply walk away. The phone rang again, dragging her back into the present, and this time, when she pressed it to her ear, a woman's voice greeted her, smooth, gentle, and chillingly cold, a voice trained to sound compassionate while every word cut like a knife. "Miss Wexler," the woman said, "I hope you understand that I bear you no ill will. I'm not angry, and I don't hold a grudge. I'm simply making a few adjustments." Margot tightened her grip on the phone. "Who are you?" she asked, though she already had a faint idea. "My name matters less than what I can do," the voice replied, as calmly as though she were discussing the weather. "Your sister needs dialysis on specific days, and you know that better than anyone. I, meanwhile, am holding something in my hands that is currently inside your home. We're both practical women, Miss Wexler, so I believe we can reach an understanding. You return what belongs to me, and every door opens for the child again. It's as simple as that." The call ended, leaving Margot sitting on the cold floor, the phone slipping from her numb fingers as she looked around her small apartment, at the bedroom door behind which her sister was sleeping, at the stranger still breathing on the kitchen floor, and she felt all her strength, all her hope, all the will she had used to keep fighting for so long beginning to run dry, draining away one drop at a time, leaving her alone at the deepest bottom of an abyss she no longer knew how to climb out of. The dialysis session was refused at the clinic door, where a receptionist with apologetic but helpless eyes explained that the system showed Junie's benefits had been suspended, that without insurance authorization they couldn't proceed, and Margot stood there holding her sister in her arms, begging, explaining, pleading. But the people behind the glass counter were only small cogs inside a machine larger than any of them, and there was nothing they could do. She took Junie home, telling herself she would find a way, that she only needed to hold on for one more day, that she would manage somehow, because she always managed somehow. But when darkness fell, she faced the chilling truth that her sister's small body couldn't wait for Margot to find a solution. Junie grew utterly exhausted and lay limp on the sofa, her dull eyes half closed, and when Margot called her name, the child answered only in faint, broken murmurs, confused and distant, as though she were slowly drifting toward someplace far away. Her breathing became shallower and shorter, and Margot, who had spent her life reading these signs on reports and inside laboratories, understood at once what was happening, understood the danger creeping into every cell of her sister's body, and terror swept through her so fiercely that both hands turned cold. She dropped to her knees beside Junie, one hand supporting that small, pale face, the other trembling as it searched for her phone, and she called Dr. Priya, the pediatric kidney specialist who had always treated the child with kindness, the only person in that cold system who still saw the two sisters as human beings. "Priya, please," she choked into the phone. "She isn't all right. She's confused. Her breathing is so weak. They refused her dialysis session, and I don't know what to do. Please." And while she waited, Margot did the only thing her hands knew how to do. She began counting her sister's breaths, 1, 2, 3, measuring each fragile rhythm as though the numbers themselves might hold her there. And in that desperate moment, she suddenly understood the deepest and cruelest irony of her life. She could read every number in the world, every measurement, every result, every chart. She knew exactly what Junie's body lacked, what it needed, and what had to be done to save her. She carried all that knowledge inside her mind, and yet she couldn't afford the simple thing her sister needed. She couldn't turn knowledge into action because she lacked a piece of paper granting permission, lacked the money, lacked the right to save her own sister. The numbers she counted, once a lifeline, had become only the echo of her helplessness. Each count another reminder that she knew everything and could do nothing. "Don't go," she whispered beside Junie's ear as tears streamed down her face. "Please don't go. I'm here. Listen to me count. Just keep breathing with me." Then the door flew open, and Priya rushed inside carrying her medical bag and the supplies she had risked taking outside official procedure, and the doctor immediately knelt beside the child, her practiced, steady hands doing everything that had to be done. Time seemed to stop inside the small room. There was only Margot's breathing and Priya's urgent movements until, at last, Junie's breaths gradually became steadier and deeper. Her face relaxed, and she slipped into peaceful sleep, safe now, pulled back from the edge she had come so close to crossing. Priya looked up and nodded at Margot, a nod that said the child would be all right, and Margot collapsed, her whole body shaking with relief and exhaustion. After Priya quietly left, having given her careful instructions, Margot lifted her sleeping sister into her arms and held her tightly against her chest, as though letting go would mean losing her, then carried her into the bathroom and turned on the shower, letting the rushing water fill the room with noise. She sank onto the cold tile floor with Junie cradled in her arms and finally allowed herself to cry, her strangled sobs swallowed by the falling water, so the little sister sleeping peacefully against her would never have to hear how completely Margot was breaking apart. The following morning, while Margot still hadn't found the strength to recover from the horror of the night before, the man in black returned, and this time his words weren't an offer but a simple fact, that remaining in the apartment meant placing both sisters within reach of the people who had stripped everything from her in a single morning, and that the only place in the city Bellwether's hands couldn't touch was his home. Margot was too exhausted to resist, and somewhere deep inside she knew he was right. So she packed the few belongings they had, lifted her still pale little sister into her arms, and allowed him to take them away. The car left the narrow streets of Providence behind, crossed the bridges, and headed toward Newport, where the sea opened wide and endless, before finally stopping in front of an enormous gray stone mansion perched on a headland overlooking Narragansett Bay, a place so vast and magnificent that Margot could only stand there, breathless, staring. But when she stepped inside, what she felt wasn't awe at the wealth, but a strange emptiness, a heavy stillness that filled the high, spacious rooms, the endless corridors, the expensive furnishings arranged with flawless precision yet stripped of warmth. Only one person lived in that immense house, and now there were the two sisters as well, 3 human beings swallowed by a place built for dozens, and Margot suddenly noticed something peculiar. Across all those walls, among countless works of art and costly decorations, there wasn't a single family photograph, not one familiar face, not one preserved moment, as though the owner had deliberately erased every trace of the people who had once belonged to him, or had never had anyone worth preserving at all. Junie, with the miraculous resilience of childhood, recovered enough to begin exploring, and before long she was hurrying through the vast rooms on her small feet, their soft steps echoing across the marble floors, her bright laughter filling spaces that had been silent for years, breathing into that frozen house a warmth it had never known. The man in black stood watching her, and a strange bewilderment passed across his face, as though he had no idea what to do with something so small and alive inside his lifeless home, his gloved hands hanging uncertainly at his sides, with nowhere to go. Then Junie, after sitting in a corner for a while and drawing intently with the box of crayons Margot always carried for her, rose, ran over to him, and held out a sheet of paper. On it was a cat drawn in the innocent, uneven strokes of a child, round and fat, with long crooked whiskers and eyes as large as buttons, clumsy and misshapen, yet overflowing with the kind of affection only a child could give without condition. "I drew it for you," she said, lifting her shining eyes to his. "Because your house is too sad. Now it has a cat to make it happy. The man who could make an entire city fear his name. The man who could drain the color from the faces of powerful men with a single quiet sentence, stood perfectly still, then slowly reached out and accepted the paper, holding it in both hands as though it were something impossibly fragile, something that might disappear if he handled it carelessly. It was the first gift a child had ever given him, and there was something in his eyes at that moment that made Margot's throat tighten even from across the room. But the warmth of that moment was broken by a harsh voice from the doorway. An older man with graying hair and the cold, cutting gaze of someone who had lived in the underworld too long, a man she would later learn was named Emmett, the family's longtime right hand. "What are you thinking?" he hissed, making no effort to lower his voice. "Bringing a debtor and a sick child into this house, into the very heart of everything we're protecting. If your father were alive, he would shoot you for this stupidity." The man in black turned, and his voice remained calm, but there was an unshakable finality beneath it. "My father shot a great many people, Emmett," he replied. That never proved he was right. Then he ordered rooms prepared for the two sisters. But Margot noticed that he was careful not to tell Emmett where Junie's room was located within the sprawling house. A small detail she didn't understand at the time, though it left her with the faint sense that something about it was unusual. Night fell, and after Junie had drifted into deep sleep and the house had once again sunk into silence, the man in black found Margot sitting alone beside a tall window overlooking the bay, and he approached carrying a cup of steaming tea, setting it down before her with an awkwardness that suggested he had never done such a thing before, and had no idea how to do it properly. The tea was terrible, far too bitter and brewed all wrong, but Margot drank every drop, one slow sip at a time, because she understood that what he had offered her wasn't truly tea, but an effort, the awkward gesture of a man who had never learned how to care for anyone. "You aren't accustomed to looking after other people," she said softly, and one corner of his mouth lifted in a rare, fleeting smile. "I'm not accustomed to owing anyone," he replied, then settled into the chair across from her, his gaze fixed on the black waters of the bay beyond the window. Margot couldn't sleep that night, and when she left her room to fetch water for her sister, she stopped by accident in the hallway, because through the narrow opening of the study door, she heard his deep, quiet voice. He was speaking on the telephone, and she stood perfectly still when she realized he was talking about Junie, arranging something in a tone that allowed no refusal. He was securing a dialysis appointment for her at another clinic, somewhere clean and safe, completely removed from the rotten system that had abandoned her, and he gave precise instructions that everything must remain discreet, that Junie's name mustn't appear on any document that could be traced. What tightened Margot's heart wasn't simply that he was doing it, but the way he did it, quietly and without ceremony, with no intention of telling her, expecting no gratitude and demanding nothing in return. This wasn't a gift meant to be displayed, not another envelope placed on a table to purchase peace of mind, but a silent act carried out in darkness simply because it needed to be done. And in that moment, something inside Margot began to shift. The wall of suspicion she had built around this man started to crack, because she had lived long enough in a world where everyone wanted to take something to recognize the true shape of kindness when it asked for nothing in return. She quietly returned to her room, but the following morning, when the two of them sat together again in the mansion's vast kitchen, she couldn't keep silent. "I heard you on the telephone last night," she said. "About my sister. You didn't have to do that." He didn't look embarrassed or attempt to deny it. He only shrugged. "The child needs dialysis. I have the means to arrange it. It's as simple as that." But Margot shook her head. "No, it isn't simple. You could have told me so I would know I owed you, but you didn't." He remained silent for a long time, his gaze distant, then spoke, his voice falling lower. "There was a time in my life," he said slowly, "when I lived in a place where no one did anything for another person without demanding twice as much in return. A place where kindness was a luxury, and trusting someone was the quickest way to be destroyed. I learned there that the only way to give without being used is to give in silence, without letting anyone know, not even the person receiving it. He stopped and said nothing more about what that place had been, but Margot heard in his voice the shadow of a dark past he wasn't yet prepared to reveal, an old wound still aching beneath the shell of ice. She didn't ask, because she understood that some wounds were only spoken of when enough trust had been earned, and she respected his silence. Between the two wounded people sitting there in the morning light spilling through the windows, something quietly began to grow. Not a loud or consuming passion, but a gentle understanding, a fragile thread connecting two souls who both knew what it meant to lose, to be alone, and to carry burdens far heavier than anyone should have been asked to bear. They looked at one another, and in that moment no words were needed, only the silent recognition that each had glimpsed the true person hidden behind the other's defenses. Then he rose and walked toward the window, and when he spoke again, his voice had regained its usual sharpness, yet there was something different beneath it, an urgency she had never heard before. "You need to understand something, Margot," he said, using her name for the first time. "The woman behind Bellwether, the one who called you, can buy anything and anyone in this city. Police officers, judges, politicians, doctors, they all have a price, and she has paid to own them. But there is one thing she can't buy, the one thing she fears even more than she fears me." He turned to face her, his gaze deep and unreadable. "And that thing is you." Margot stared at him, unable to understand, and the most obvious question burst from her lips, the question anyone in her position would have asked. If that woman is truly so dangerous, if she's behind all of this, then why don't you simply get rid of her? The whole city knows who you are. Isn't that how men like you usually solve everything? The man in black turned to look at her, and a bitter smile flickered across his lips, the smile of someone who had considered exactly what she had just said, who had waited hundreds of times through sleepless nights. "Do you think I haven't considered it?" he said softly. "I could make her disappear from this world before sunrise. For me, that would be the easiest thing in the world, but that's exactly the trap she's laid, and she's far more intelligent than you realize." He walked to the table, placed both hands on the wooden surface, and explained, one word at a time, the truth that had rendered even him powerless. The woman who controlled Bellwether didn't merely possess the ledgers documenting the money laundering. She also held the medical records of tens of thousands of people, the files of every patient across the entire network of clinics under her control, and all of it was encrypted, locked inside a system for which she alone possessed the key. "Do you understand what that means?" he asked, his eyes heavy with the weight of it. "It means every person in that system, every patient who needs dialysis, medication, or treatment to stay alive, is being held hostage by her. If I kill her, the system will lock itself permanently, every record will be sealed away, and tens of thousands of people will lose access to treatment overnight. They'll die slowly, not because of a bullet, but because of a locked door." He paused, allowing the full weight of those words to sink into her. "And among the tens of thousands of names trapped inside that system, there's one name you care about more than all the others. Junie." Margot felt as though a cold hand had closed around her heart, because she understood at once. Her little sister, her precious baby sister, was a hostage in a war she didn't even know existed. "I can't use force," he continued. "I can't use guns. I can't use my fists. And I can't use any of the things I've always been good at. She's built a fortress where every tool I possess has become useless. I can't kill a server, Margot. I can't threaten a line of data." Then he looked at her differently, with an expression that was part plea and part desperate appeal, and he said the words that changed everything. "But you can, because you're the one thing she never expected. You're the blind spot in every calculation she made." Margot shook her head, unable to understand how a woman who had lost everything could possibly threaten an empire. "I'm just a laboratory technician who got fired," she said. "I have nothing," but he shook his head, and a new sharpness came alive in his eyes. "You have two things no one else in this world possesses at the same time," he said. "First, you're Junie's legal guardian, her biological sister, and she's a patient inside that woman's system. That gives you the legal right, a right no one can deny, to demand your sister's complete treatment history, all of it, every single line. She can't refuse you without breaking the law. Second, and this is what truly makes you dangerous, you understand those numbers. You can read those charts and tables the way other people read a page in a book. She built her entire empire on one assumption, that poor people, sick people, Human beings reduced to data, would never read their own bills, would never understand what was being done to them. But you read them, you understand. He leaned closer, and his voice dropped into a whisper that seemed to shake the room. She intended to turn you into one more nameless line of data in her ledgers, but in doing so, she accidentally created the only thing capable of destroying her. She created a witness. Margot sat in silence, feeling the full weight of what had just been placed upon her shoulders. Her entire life, this system had crossed out her name, reduced her to a file, a number, a thing instead of a person, from the day she lost her mother, through temporary homes, through an unfinished medical education, through every debt collection notice that had ever arrived. And now this man was telling her that the very knowledge the system had dismissed as harmless, the very name it believed it had erased, was the only weapon capable of bringing it down. The question hung in the air between them, the question whose answer would determine the course of the rest of her life. Did a woman who had been erased by the world again and again possess enough courage to walk directly into the lair of the person who had erased her and demand her name back? Margot's answer hadn't yet begun to take shape when a hoarse voice sounded from the doorway, and both of them turned to see the younger brother standing there, leaning against the frame to support his still weakened body, his face deathly pale not because of his wound, but because of some burden crushing him from within. He had heard everything, and now he could no longer remain silent. The strange silence that had clung to him since the night he saw the bill had become an unbearable torment. "There's something," he said, his voice trembling. "Something I have to tell you. Even though once I say it, I may never be forgiven." He stepped into the room, each step heavy, and his eyes found Margot's with an agony so deep it seemed almost unbearable to witness. "That list," he said, "the list of ghost patients, the names entered into the records so dirty money could flow through them. Years ago, when I was young and foolish, when I still believed I was only doing harmless paperwork for the family, I was the one who created it. I was the one who sat there night after night, encrypting every name, arranging every number, turning every human being into a clean, orderly line of data." He stopped, and tears began to slide down his pale face. "And one of the names I placed on that list, one of the people I turned into data, was that little girl. It was Junie Wexler." The entire room seemed to freeze. Margot felt the ground collapse beneath her feet, felt all the air vanish from her lungs, because what he had just said couldn't possibly be true. It couldn't be true that the man she had knelt in freezing water to save, the man for whom she had risked both her life and the future of that life just to keep him breathing, was the very person who had pushed her sister into that merciless machine. "You're lying," she whispered, even though somewhere inside herself she already knew it was true. "Tell me you're lying." But he only shook his head, and the words that followed, that confession so naked and cruel, would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I wish I could tell you that. But back then, they were never people to me. They were only lines of text, do you understand? Just names on a screen, numbers in a spreadsheet. I never thought that behind each line was a real person, a real child, a sister lying awake all night worrying about her. I turned your sister into a line of data, and I didn't even know she existed." Margot stepped backward, both hands covering her mouth, and a storm of emotion surged through her. Rage, betrayal, disgust, and above all, a bitter irony so unbearable it nearly broke her, because she had given the most precious compassion she possessed, the compassion born from her mother's death, to the very man who had helped bring suffering upon her sister. She rushed from the room and into the corridor, pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her whole body trembling, her stomach twisting into knots, and for a long time she simply stood there, trying to breathe, trying to gather the shattered pieces of a world that had just been turned completely upside down. The younger brother followed her out and stopped some distance away, his head bowed. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said softly. "I don't deserve that. I only wanted you to know the truth, because you have the right to know who it was you saved." Margot straightened and turned to look at him, and in her tear-filled eyes there was now not only pain, but something harder beginning to take shape. She could leave, she could turn her back on all of them, take her sister far away, and let this rotten world destroy itself. But she thought of the uneven handwriting on the back of the bill. She thought of the tens of thousands of other people trapped inside that system, people who had no one to save them, no one to read the numbers that were deciding their fate, and she understood that her pain, the terrible pain that had just been dealt to her, could become one of two things: a wound that brought her to her knees, or a fire that gave her the strength to fight. "I don't forgive you," she said, her voice cold and steady. "Maybe I never will. But I'm not leaving. Not because of you, but because of every other name on your list. All the people no one else is willing to read for." She turned away from him, walked back into the room, and went straight to where Junie's records lay on the table, the papers that had set everything in motion. She picked them up with hands that no longer trembled, pressed them tightly against her chest, and in that moment, a decision was sealed inside her heart, final and irreversible. The man in black had ordered his people to dig into every corner of Bellwether's records, tracing every stream of money, every connection, and while they were doing so, they accidentally brushed against another thread, one that led directly to the enormous debt that had hung over Margot's head for so long, the debt that bore the name of her late husband. And when he found her that afternoon, sitting beside the window with the file still clutched tightly against her chest, he hesitated in a way he rarely did before speaking, as though even he didn't want to be the one who had to bring her this news. "There's something I have to tell you," he began, his voice slow and measured. "This is going to hurt you, and I'm sorry for that, but you deserve to know the truth." Margot looked up, and a vague sense of dread began to rise within her. "Your husband," he said. "Curtis. You still believe he died of an illness, that you tried to save him and failed, and that the debt was the cost of his treatment." He paused, his eyes filled with compassion. "But he never died, Margot." The words rang through her mind like a shattered bell, and all she could do was shake her head, unable to believe him. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible. I mourned him. But he continued, gently yet without mercy, laying bare the cruel truth. Years earlier, Curtis had also worked in the field. He too had been someone who could read numbers the way she could, and he had stumbled upon Bellwether's money laundering operation. But instead of exposing it, instead of doing what was right, he chose the most cowardly path. He accepted money to remain silent and disappear, leaving behind a death fabricated through paperwork and a fraudulent debt placed in the name of the wife he had abandoned, as though he had settled the last part of his filthy bargain with her life. "He didn't die in your arms," the man said softly. "He simply walked out the door and never came back, leaving you to carry all of it alone." Margot sat motionless, and this pain was unlike any pain she had ever known before, because it didn't merely take something from her present, it rewrote her entire past. All the years she had blamed herself for failing to save him, all the nights she had lain awake beneath the guilt of someone who believed she had been powerless, had been built upon a lie. She had carried all that suffering for nothing, for a man who had never deserved it. "So I mourned a man who sold me out," she said, her voice catching with bitterness. "I was nothing more than a line of numbers in their books too, a debt used to balance the accounts, exactly like what they did to my sister." And at that moment, the man in black did something she had never seen him do before. He slowly removed the black leather gloves from his hands, and when his bare skin was exposed beneath the afternoon light, she saw a faded row of numbers tattooed across his wrist, a lifeless sequence, the kind of mark placed upon a person only when someone wanted to turn that person into something that could be labeled, counted, and controlled. "This is why I always wear gloves," he said softly. "There was a time in my life when I was locked behind bars, and in that place, I was no longer a human being. I was this number. For all those years, no one called me by my name, they only read these numbers aloud. I understand what it feels like to be turned into a thing instead of a person, Margot. I understand it down to the bone." The two of them sat there, each carrying a number the world had assigned to them, and in that moment of understanding, an invisible bond tightened even more firmly between them. But then his expression changed, becoming cold and calculating, because while following those other threads, he had finally fitted the last piece into place, a truth he had kept hidden inside himself. The man who had told the assassins where to find his younger brother, the traitor within his own ranks whom he had suspected since the very first night, was Emmett, the right hand he had trusted for so many years. But he couldn't act yet. He couldn't expose the old betrayer, because every piece of evidence that could condemn Emmett was locked inside the same encrypted archive belonging to Bellwether, the same fortress of data guarded by the woman who ruled it. To bring Emmett down, he first had to open that lock, which meant the fate of the traitor inside his house and the woman controlling the enemy outside had become bound together. They could only fall at the same time, by means of the same single key. And that key, he knew, was sitting directly in front of him. He drew a breath and began to explain the plan. But first he made one thing clear. What he was about to propose wasn't an order. It wasn't something he intended to force upon her. It was a choice, and it was a choice whose cost, for the most part, would be paid by him. "The plan is this," he said, spreading the files across the table. "You use your legal authority to demand Junie's complete treatment records. She'll be required to hand them over, or she'll be breaking the law. But to retrieve your sister's records from the system, that system has to be unlocked, and once it opens, the entire body of data inside it will be exposed to the light. Every piece of evidence connected to the money laundering operation, every name that was turned into data, all of it." He paused, and his expression became more solemn than Margot had ever seen it. "But there's something you need to understand, Margot, and I won't hide it from you. That archive doesn't contain only her crimes. It contains mine as well, and the crimes of my entire family, more than a decade of dirty money flowing through my hands. When you open that door to save tens of thousands of people, you'll also expose me to justice. I'll lose everything. My freedom, my empire, perhaps even the rest of my life." Margot stared at him, stunned. "Then why?" she asked. "Why would you do this, when it means condemning yourself? You could find another way. Something dirtier, something faster, something that wouldn't require you to pay the price." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I could. There's a path covered in blood, and it would be much faster. But people would die on that path, many of them, and some would be innocent. This is the only way where no lives have to be lost, and I've lived long enough in a world filled with bodies." Then he did something that left Margot speechless. He didn't turn to her to seal the agreement. Instead, he walked to where Junie was sitting in the corner of the room, drawing, and slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself down to the child's eye level, until the eyes of the most powerful man in the city were level with the clear, innocent eyes of an 8-year-old girl. "Junie," he said, his voice so gentle that Margot could hardly believe it belonged to the same man who had just spoken of prison and death. "Your sister is about to do something very important and very dangerous, something that could help a great many people, but could also place her in danger. I want to ask what you think first. Do you agree to let your sister do it?" Junie set down her crayon, tilted her head in the endearingly serious way children do when they're thinking deeply, then looked up at her sister before turning back to the man. "Will it help other children who are sick like me?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "A great many of them." Junie nodded with certainty. "Then I agree. My sister is the bravest person I know." And in that moment, something broke open inside Margot, because no one in her entire life had ever treated her little sister's voice as though it mattered. No one had ever asked a child what she thought before deciding the affairs of adults. He rose to his feet and turned back toward Margot. "I'll never force you to do this," he said. "All my life, I've made people sign things they didn't want to sign. I've used fear to make them obey. If I force you into this with fear, then how am I any different from her? I'd only be a better-dressed version of the same monster. Consent given under pressure is rotten at its roots. You have to choose for yourself." Margot remained silent for a long time, then raised her head, and there was a new, unyielding light in her eyes. "I'll do it," she said. "But I have one condition, and it isn't negotiable." He waited. "No one dies," she said. "Not the woman who runs Bellwether, not the traitor inside your house, not even Curtis, whether he deserves it or not. We'll bring them down with the truth, with the law, with light, not with blood. If you want me to enter this game, then we play it my way." The man in black studied her for a long while, and conflict appeared across his face, because what she was asking meant abandoning the only weapon he had trusted his entire life, forcing him to fight with his hands bound. "You're asking me to throw away the one thing I truly know how to do," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "That's exactly why it's called a condition." A long silence passed between them, and then, instead of arguing, the man did something no one had ever seen him do for anyone. He picked up the pen, drew the agreement toward himself, and signed his name first, placing his fate in her hands before asking her to place hers in his. Then he slid the pen toward her, and Margot, the woman the world had erased again and again, took it, drew a deep breath, and set the tip to the page, officially entering a game from which there would be no turning back. Bellwether's headquarters towered over the financial district, a cold glass monolith rising into the sky, and Margot entered it not with a gun or an army, but with a borrowed leather briefcase containing a lawful petition, a single sheet of paper that, under the law, the woman sitting on the highest floor had no right to refuse. She was escorted into the vast office where the woman waited, and for the first time, the two of them faced each other, the one who had built an empire upon the suffering of the poor, and the one who had been crushed beneath that same empire. The woman who ruled Bellwether smiled, a perfectly polished smile, and invited Margot to sit as though they were two business partners preparing to discuss a deal. "Miss Wexler," she said, her voice as smooth as it had been during their first telephone call. "I have to admit, you've surprised me. Very few people dare to walk all the way in here." She leaned forward and began the defense she had probably repeated to herself for years so she could sleep at night. "You think I'm a monster, but do you know that every year, I keep dozens of clinics open in the poorest communities, places no one else can be bothered to care about? Do you know where the money to maintain all of them comes from? It has to come from somewhere. I signed those papers so children could live, Miss Wexler. I did what had to be done." Margot looked at her, and there was no fear left inside her, only a cold and steady calm. "No," she said softly, "you didn't sign those papers so they could live. You signed them so they could become valuable. You looked at a sick child and didn't see a human being. You saw a stream of money that could flow through them. Those are two entirely different things, and that difference is what separates a person from a monster." Then Margot placed the briefcase on the desk and opened it, but instead of taking out the petition, she removed Junie's stack of bills, the papers that had begun everything. She turned them over, revealing the back, where a round, fat cat had been drawn with long whiskers and eyes as large as buttons, the innocent, uneven strokes of a child, and she pushed it across the desk toward the powerful woman. "This is your line of data," she said, her voice trembling with emotion but not with weakness. "She's 8 years old. She likes drawing cats. She carefully practiced writing her own name on the back of the debt notices you sent her. You turned her into a number. I brought her here so you would have to look directly at the person whose name you erased." The smile on the Bellwether woman's lips stiffened, and for the first time, a flicker of panic crossed her eyes. She reached for the button to summon security, but the office door flew open, and the person who entered wasn't a guard. It was the younger brother, one hand still bandaged, accompanied by a group of attorneys and 2 federal prosecutors with gleaming badges, because while Margot had entered through the front door carrying her petition, the man in black had quietly entered through another door, the door of the prosecutor's office, and surrendered himself along with every ledger belonging to his family. Her demand for Junie's records forced the system to unlock, and the moment that vast body of data opened beneath the light, it exposed not only the crimes of the woman who controlled Bellwether, but everything buried inside it. Every name, every transaction, every accomplice. And among that mountain of information, one name appeared that drained even the color from her face. The name of Emmett, the traitor who had secretly joined forces with her to betray his own family, the man who had ordered the assassins to find the younger brother. Both of them, the enemy outside and the betrayer within, were bound together by the same body of evidence, and now they fell together through the use of the same key, exactly as the man in black had calculated. It was an intricate trap he had built using his own freedom as bait, a move in which he sacrificed his entire empire to make certain not a single drop of blood would be spilled, just as Margot had demanded. The prosecutors read the warrants, and before the stunned eyes of the woman who had believed herself untouchable only moments earlier, both she and Emmett were led away, not through violence, not through bullets, but through documents, through truth, through the very weapon they had used to crush so many human lives. Margot stood in the center of the room, her chest rising and falling, clutching the bills with the cat drawing tightly against her heart, and she looked through the glass windows at the city stretching below, the city where tens of thousands of people had once been imprisoned in the darkness of numbers, and she knew that in that very moment, as the system was torn open, each of their names, each forgotten human being, was finally being returned to themselves. The months that followed swept through the city like a flood, washing away its old and decaying order. The man in black was brought before a court and sentenced for the years of wrongdoing he had committed. The empire his family had built over generations broke apart piece by piece. The harbor passed into new hands, and the hidden networks beneath the city were dragged into the light. The woman who ruled Bellwether and the traitor within the family both paid for what they had done with fitting sentences behind bars, and most important of all, the condition Margot had declared non-negotiable was honored completely. No one died. Justice was carried out through truth and law rather than blood. The vast archive of records was released under court supervision, and tens of thousands of people who had once been imprisoned in the darkness of numbers were finally returned to the light. Thousands of patients who had been unjustly denied treatment were contacted again and welcomed back into the care of a system that was finally working as it had always been meant to work. And amid that current of healing, something miraculous came to Junie. Once the transplant waiting list had been cleansed of fraud and injustice, it finally began operating fairly, and a kidney from an anonymous donor became available to her. Not because of magic, not because of money or influence, but simply because a system that was supposed to be right had finally been restored to what was right. Before going to court to receive a reduced sentence in recognition of his cooperation, the younger brother came to see Margot one final time. He didn't ask her to forgive him, because he knew some things couldn't be erased by words alone. Instead, he handed her a thick stack of papers, and written across those pages was the complete list of every name he had once reduced to a lifeless number, each person painstakingly found and written down, so that not one of them would be overlooked when the system was opened and repaired. "I can't return what I took from them," he said, "but I can make certain not one name is forgotten again." Margot took the list and looked at the names stretching from one page to the next, and she understood that this wasn't an apology. It was atonement through action. "I still don't forgive you," she said softly, though some of the coldness had left her voice. "But you must remember the name of every person on this list. Carve them into your heart. That will be your punishment, and it will also be your path toward redemption." 6 years passed like a quiet river, slowly healing every wound. Margot was no longer the laboratory technician who had once been fired. She had completed the education she had been forced to abandon and had become a pediatric nephrologist. And in a twist that was both ironic and beautiful, she now worked at the very community clinic that had once dismissed her, wearing a white coat and healing children who reminded her of the little sister she had once fought so desperately to save. Framed with care on the wall of her office was the drawing of the round, fat cat with eyes like 2 large buttons, a gentle reminder of everything they had endured. Junie, once the small and fragile child who had seemed so close to slipping away, was now a lively 14-year-old girl, healthy, stubborn, and full of life. That very morning, the sisters had argued fiercely about what time she had to come home, because Junie wanted to stay out late with her friends, an ordinary and tender disagreement that made Margot silently thank life every time it happened, because she knew there were families who would never be given the blessing of arguing over something so normal. Dr. Priya, her friend and colleague who now worked beside her, once told Margot something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Do you know why you saved him in that alley that night? And why you were able to save all those other people? It wasn't because you worked in medicine. It was because, on that rainy night, while an entire city turned away, you were the only person who looked at a dying life and saw a human being, not a problem to avoid." Then, one afternoon in March, as the familiar rain once again spread across Providence, the clinic door opened softly, and a man stepped inside. There was more silver in his hair now, and this time his hands were bare, holding a paper bag soaked through by the rain. "I was released 2 years early," he said quietly, his eyes searching for hers. Margot looked up, and a smile appeared on her lips, a smile she had kept waiting through all those years. "I know," she replied. "I've always been counting," because over those years, her habit of counting had changed. It was no longer a way to endure fear or helplessness. Now she counted the healthy days of her sister's life, counted the children she had helped heal, and counted down each day until this man returned. Margot Wexler's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that in a world always trying to reduce human beings to numbers, records, profit, and loss, the bravest and most humane thing any of us can do is look at another person and truly see a person, speak their name correctly, and give them the dignity they have always deserved. Compassion is never foolishness. Kindness offered without calculation may come at a cost, but in the end, it is the very thing that saves both the giver and the one who receives it. A name remembered, a life valued, can change an entire destiny, and sometimes even an entire city. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue spreading meaningful content and bringing you more compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Margot's story and the choices she made? What would you have done in her place? Please leave a comment below and share what you truly feel in your heart, because we always hope to hear your thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moment. May you and those you love always enjoy good health, happiness, peace, and serenity each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.